for the Flathead County.
This meeting is being recorded.
Got it. Okay. All right. And I am new to writing coaches, but I'm not new to public education. For 39 years, I was a classroom teacher, mostly middle school science, and I integrated writing into my curriculum with interactive notebooks, lab reports, research topics. In the last 6 years, I was an assessment specialist with the Research Evaluation and Assessment Department at the Tempe Elementary District. And I spent many hours developing the district writing assessment for grades K-8 and had the opportunity to work very closely with Dr. Steve Graham, who is a professor in the Division of Leadership and Innovation in the Teachers College at the Arizona State University. So when Cassie asked me to facilitate this, I was excited to read the Running and Horn article that Dr. Sun sent with references to Dr. Graham. Now, I want to welcome everybody and give beaucoup thanks to Dr. Sun for giving us time in her busy schedule. Now, Shasta is going to drop a couple of questions into the chat. Shasta is our intern, and she's going to be running the technical side of this. She is recording this for us. And if you are speaking, okay, leave your mic on. But if you're not speaking, please put your mic on mute. When we'd also like you to identify yourself in the chat, let us know if you're a board member or what your current profession or past profession is. Dr. Sun had 2 questions. Shasta, just tell us, what are those 2 questions?
Yeah, so those 2 questions, I've just posted them, are 1, what has motivated you to write? And 2, what has motivated you to become a volunteer at WC? Great questions.
Okay, so we give everybody a couple of minutes to write in the chat. Their first name will do and what their interest is. In the essence of time, we are having you put that in the chat rather than go around and hear your voice. And Dr. Beverly Chin is with us also. Thank you, Beverly.
Jeannie, this is Michelle Mywald. I just wanted to let you know that I am on the call just on my phone. And so I don't have access to the chat, but I just wanted to let you know that I'm here. Then I don't know if there are others who are on just by phone or not, but I don't have access to the chat in that case.
Okay, and this is, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Michelle Mywald,
Okay,
president
hi,
of the
Michelle.
board.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, can you give us an audio answer? Has motivated you to write?
Yes, actually, in my when I was school age, I had a couple of teachers who were instrumental in turning me on to journaling, and I have done that, though I don't make it a practice, and I probably should. But I work full time as a labor relations specialist, and I honestly 34 years ago started my career as a legal assistant, and so I write a lot in my daily work, which may be why I don't write as often for my own, for pleasure, for my own purposes.
Understood.
And I think that I might once I retire.
Okay.
But anyway, fascinated with the topic, and what motivated me to be a writing coach is that it was difficult for me to write as a young person, because I learned the conventions. I didn't really learn how to write, and Writing Coaches of Montana has provided sort of an illumination of something that I was probably missing as a young person. And I just want to bring that to young people and make it less scary and easier to get their ideas on a page. So I don't want to take up all the time, but those are my motivations.
Well, thank you so very, very much. And again, I want to absolutely thank Jingjing Sun. She is an associate professor of educational psychology at the Department of Teaching and Learning and an awardee of an Early Stage Investigator Career Award from the National Institutes of Health. Her research is centered on the processes of learning and development, with a current focus on youth's socio-emotional development and school engagement, specifically working with the indigenous communities in Montana. So I am very, very happy to turn this over to Dr. Sun, who had the 2 questions, what motivates people to write? And she was also curious about what age group you are most interested in. So if you could just pop in the chat, what age group, so she could see what her audience looks like. And Dr. Sun, how about if we turn it over to you now?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting. I love sharing my experiences and my research background, and just preparing for this workshop bring me so much memory of my writing experience as a young writer and then not so young writer. And to give everybody a background of me, I grew up in China, started learning English as a school subject when I was 6. So, and at that time I take about 2 English lessons per week. So learning English as a foreign language. When I was in college, I was majored in English. That became more formative training of writing this language. And it is when in 2009, I came to the United States and started my graduate study in the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. That's where I'm fully immersed in the English environment and also in a very different type of writing, academic writing in a way that is persuasive, informative, very different from my previous habitual writing of journaling. So for me, I feel myself as a lifelong writer, a lifelong learner of writing, and also being able to learn these 2 very different language systems, Chinese as a logographic language and English as alphabetic language. And also when I was in grad school, my former PhD advisor is the director for the Center of Study of Reading. So understanding the connection between reading and writing, and how do we support students reading better and writing better has been a central theme of my work, regardless of how extended to other areas such as children's social emotional learning. So I want to share that background information of me, of how I came to where I am. And writing is such a huge topic. And Jeannie, when you mentioned that you work with Steve Graham, I was like, wow, that's one of the top leader in the research of writing. And I actually was just reading one of his latest article in Educational Psychologist that talk about his 4 decades of writing research. I will share that article with a group later after today's meeting. Yeah, and he had this very fascinating podcast talking about what he was trying to share in that article. But, you know, with writing, there are different parts of writing skill, writing knowledge, writing strategies, and writing motivation. So today we're just going to dive into one of the 4 components on the motivation part. And I'm happy to return at another time to talk about other areas, but want to highlight that it is a motivation part of what motivates students to write. And that's why I ask all of you. I see some question here, some of your response of wanting to help others as your motivation to be a coach. and let's see, capture my thoughts through writing. And I think Michelle mentioned she is motivated to write because she wants to explore just beyond the convention of writing. So there are different areas of that writing motivation. And the first part, and before we dive into it, I also want to say I'm functioning best with discussion. And that also has been shown by research of passively listening is not the best way to learn. So I really encourage all of you to be an active participant today in terms of asking questions, share your experiences. So it's not just me trying to pass on information, but I believe I can learn from all of you. Maybe we can kick off the discussion with some questions if any of you have from reading the article or your experiences as a volunteer.
All right, Shasta, you said that Chris emailed one question in. Perhaps we should start with that one.
Yes, I was just about to bring that up. Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, so Chris said, it's kind of a long one, so just a heads up. He says, writing coaches agree that the development of critical thinking is our key goal for the students we work with. The Burning and Horn article suggests that grounding writing assignments to relevant current student needs and or interests is key to motivating them. How would Dr. Sun suggest teachers position the need to develop strong critical thinking as a relevant goal to students for whom the idea may seem abstract and far down on their hierarchy of current needs? So I can repeat that. It is very long and complex.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Grace, for asking that question. It's a fantastic question, and actually one of the questions I was working on during my graduate studies. So I mentioned that we were trying to see how kids were more interested in reading. One of the methodology we use is called collaborative reasoning. So here we give students maybe a short article to read, and it contains real life issues. It could be as small as whether a zoo is a good place for animals, or it could be as big as how do we do wolf management and regulation, the policy of wolf management and regulation in the United States. And we run it from reading short story about them to a 6-week full-fledged social study unit on this topic. But the idea is to bring a topic that does entail critical thinking. If you need to answer any of the questions, you have to think from a different perspective and examine if you have evidence for those perspectives. But also those questions are inherently interesting for the students. I mean, depends. When we did the study in Chicago, the wolf question was not nearly as exciting as students in Montana. I have teachers say, you should do the wolf unit in Montana. These urban kids never seen wolf. They were never bothered by a wolf issue compared to there are ranchers close to Yellowstone that are very worried about the wolf's impact economically, socially, on their property, on their lifestyle. But here you can see that I don't see these two as separate. I think they can be married into what kind of task we engage students in that can be personal, interesting, and relevant, but also entail critical thinking. So, and in that article, it also talked about this complex, engaging students in complex writing tasks can be inherently exciting compared to a very simple task. But here we may run into the tricky balance of how do you balance between the complexity of a writing task, but also don't let students getting overload and lost. So providing that scaffold of breaking down that writing task into manageable components that they could contribute on. I'm not sure if this address your question, Grace. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about it, or to put it back into the context of what inspired you to ask the question in the first place.
Yeah, so Chris is unfortunately not.
Oh, it's not the Chris Love we have here. I mean, is it you ask the question, Chris?
Yes, it is.
Oh, good.
Well, the reason I asked the question is because it seems to be such a driver for the writing coaches. You know, it's such a strong purpose for us. And yet I think when you name that to the students, they might just zone out. So I think your point of engaging them in topics that matter and working the critical thinking perhaps in the side door without naming it may be the most effective way to get at it. I don't know what others think, but
Yeah, I think a lot of times students didn't realize writing and critical thinking are the essential skill they involve every day. It's part of the decision-making process. And I love your idea of engaging topic they care. For example, high school students of even just whether the parental control of their media exposure, whether parents have the right to control what kind of media they are exposed to. And this kind of question can be very personally relevant for them. And then it can also be a vehicle to think about how using writing as a tool to express their opinions in the way that help them to think through the question.
I will say that I remember it was a few months ago, I was coaching at, I believe it was Sentinel, and there was an argumentative essay as the assignment for kids, and they had to choose an assignment. They had to choose a topic that was really interesting to them. I had several students, gun control, climate change regulations, things that are really pertinent to students' lives. And you could just see in their face, they just lit up. And you're like, okay, so tell me more. Why did you write this? What are you thinking? And so I think there's so much, there's just so much to be said for choosing something that the student is actually interested in. So that's great. Jane also has a question in the chat. So, how does neuroscience inform the discussion of motivation?
That's a great question. And can you be a little bit more specific, Jane, in terms of neuroscience? It's so much, right? It's ranging from neuroplasticity of how much we continue to shape our brain all the way through our life to which part of our brain that is linked to specific reading and writing components. So can you be a little bit more specific of what you were thinking?
Well, honestly, I noticed that you had, I think you had written or co-written an article on neuroscience and its impact on child development. So I thought there were specific ways that you had traced the connections there.
Thank you for asking. Yes, so I didn't write the article, but I am teaching a graduate level courses that's entitled Neuroscience and Child Development. So maybe I can talk a little bit about this connection between metacognition, executive function, and writing. So are you all familiar with the idea of metacognition or executive function? If you can raise your hand if you have heard about it. Okay, I'm glad many of you didn't raise your hand. That's good. It's always nice to learn something new. So our brain has been used as an analogy for different things. For example, many of you probably have heard about growth mindset of comparing our brain as muscle, that you work out your muscle gets stronger, and similar like your brain, you try harder, you put efforts, and your brain becomes, and that's research showing part of the drivers, this hippo area of where we identify special space is larger in text drivers in London area. So the analogy is different region of brain, the more we use it, it's just getting stronger like our muscle. So that's one area of analogy. The other analogy of thinking of brain as computer. So that's a basic of information processing theory of how we use our working memory, long-term memory to process information and being able to learn. And a third analogy that has been going on for the past decade also is that highway control of executive function is like the highway control of our brain. So thinking of a very simple instruction to the students, right? Look at your notebook, start writing about a topic about XYZ. Make sure you refer evidence to this book. And there are so many different things students have to, first of all, they have to exhibit inhibitory control, which means they have to block out all the irrelevant tasks at hand and follow instruction. The second part is what kind of strategy I need to use in order to complete this writing task. And the third strategy is, as you work on this task, how do you monitor your progress so that you see that you're on task? And if you are not on task, how do you get yourself back to it? So this consistent cycle of your brain is engaging in this process to make sure you complete any task at hand. I want to bring this into the table because writing, unlike oral language development, is a very difficult task. Many of us, either you're native speaker English or you are learning a different language like Spanish, French, you can all testify to how difficult writing is. And writing is difficult for native speaker of English children learn to write in the first place. It tap into the different resources and executive function and metacognition come into handy in terms of you almost model them to think through the process and planning for it. So let's start with setting up a goal, clear goal of writing, right? You have this task, but the task needs to be executed through these goals. This goal can be very specific in terms of how do I approach this writing task? What resources do I need to check? How much information do I need to look for? Is there anybody in this topic I could speak to? And all this come to the planning stage as step one. As students go through the writing process, that's where that evaluation and monitoring come into. Am I on task? Do I need extra support? And then finally, external feedback from teachers or writing coach like all of you can support that feedback loop. So you can see that how much of this metacognition, which is thinking about thinking, is extremely important in helping kids to go through very complicated tasks like writing. And I think that's where writing coaches like all of you can come into play, of supporting them through that goal setting stage, then to this actual execution of the plan, then to monitor how they are good at the plan. Are they on track? Do they need more support? So that's one side. The other side is many of you probably have heard the terminology of social emotional learning. It's existed before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic highlights its importance in how kids benefit from the different competences and skills, understanding themselves, managing their own emotion, getting along with others, and decision making. I want to mention this part is, the three analogy of brain's muscle, brain as highway control, and brain as computer all ignore the humanity side of human brain, right? So right now we have a meeting at 4 to 5. I hope you already eat something. If you're hungry, you're probably less patient for my speech here, right? And if you're tired, you didn't sleep well last night, you might not be able to focus. Or if you had something very exciting going on before we have this meeting, you might still thinking about it. So the writing process also engage with that emotional component. And many of you could testify to how powerful that emotional part of us is. And to a lot of students, that emotional part, unfortunately, comes in the negative and also hindering side. Did you ever hear say, I'm not a writer? I'm not good at writing.
All the time.
Right? Writing is so hard. Yeah. And so I guess my question throw back to you is when you hear those negative self-talk about writing, how do you approach them? How do you speak back to them? Anyone?
Well, one thing that I say to them is, well, not yet. To be really good at something, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So you may not be a good writer or not think you're a good writer yet.
How do they react to it?
Oh, they kind of like, oh, okay, all right, really. It does seem to take the pressure off of them because they realize, all right, this is something that we learn to do and that we progressively get better at. When I was teaching the ELL classes in reading and writing, before we would do something really difficult, I would look at them and I would say, okay, I really need you to focus now because your brain is going to go, so be ready because you're going to have a little bit of discomfort. But what that means is your brain is building connections. Maybe the neurons are firing better, and talk to the kids about what is happening physiologically at their level. And so it just letting them know it is a process. And that's what I love about writing coach, because Dr. Chin will constantly say, it's not all about the product. We are all about the process.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that.
I want to say before we move off my question, thank you for that answer. I was looking at neuroscience as a predictor or indicator of readiness in a student.
Oh.
And I could see how you connect that to the social emotional part. So that was very useful for me. And I wanted to say too, that I do hear students say, I'm not the writer in the family, my brother is. And I'll say, how do you know that? And they'll say, well, my parents told me. And I tell them I'm a writer and that I still have that same question. Am I good enough? There are people who do it better than I do. And I let them know that I think it's a lifelong thing and that's okay. You know, that's part of what makes us better. But it's hard. It's kind of heartbreaking to hear them say that when they're maybe in the 4th grade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think students label themselves pretty early. It's not only writer, it's I'm a visual learner. I'm not good at math. I can dance, which basically, for example, if you look at research in learning style, it doesn't necessarily exist. Means we took in information from all different channels, and it really depends on what kind of information you're trying to learn, right? Regardless whether you are prefer any channel, if you want to drive, you have to be physically maneuver that machine. And if you want to dance or paint, you have to be engaging that activity. But Jen, I hear you, students start to form this stifling perception of themselves at an early age. And there are multiple reasons behind it. First, there could be social impact of they look at others, they don't see a connection between what they could do and others could do, so that giving them an impression of they're not good at it. There could be also historical experiences of frustration with certain tasks. And I think my suggestion is if you hear those type of comments in the future, I want you to indulge the student a little bit more before you're trying to say, no, you were a writer. And we are all writers. I think a lot of times students come to see that is they never get a chance to question themselves of why am I not a writer? What have triggered me to think that way? So I want you to indulge them in going through this emotional and a cognitive process of explaining why it's the case. And oftentimes, research on conceptual change shows that when people had opportunity to involve in thinking, why am I think this way? How do I think this way? They're more likely to open to different opinion. So by simply telling them you are a writer or everybody writes, that doesn't necessarily change their perception, but it's more of allowing them to think, wait a second, yeah, I mess up that huge writing assignment, but maybe there are other opportunity I did do well. So I think once you allow that conversation with them and facilitate that, even allow them to see, how do you feel it when you say I'm not a writer? Is it on your shoulder? Is it on your body? I ask us, so I mentioned this, is there has been research on embodied cognition. For example, with gesture, when we talk of how gesture can deepen our understanding. So our thinking traditionally is linked to brain, but actually all parts of our body is connected to that thinking and learning process. So allowing students to process it next time when they're not with you and have this negative thought, they may have a little bit tool to go through, okay, I'm not good at writing, but Jen told me, why do I think that way? Let me take a step back. And if they have this tool, they're more likely to go through this discovery journey and maybe eventually reach out at the conclusion you're trying to tell them, saying, we are all trying to be writers. It's not either or, it's a lifelong journey. So I think that piece, I really encourage all of you to experiment and try next time if you hear negative talk, and see if you could engage them in finding a way to find a different way to think about themselves.
I really like what you've just shared with us. And I think one of the challenges that we face as writing coaches is that we're with the student for 20 or 30 minutes. And it's nice if we get to come back and be with that student again, but sometimes we're only with that student for 20 or 30 minutes. I really like the concept of having students reflect on where they received or acquired that image of themselves, whether they're effective writers or not. And one of the things that I think is a challenge for all of us as adults, whether we're classroom teachers or not, is that students do not see writers write, and writers are not thinking aloud, showing their metacognition. So all students see, even when they're watching someone write, is the keyboard's moving, the fingers are moving, they're texting, but they don't know what's happening in the writer's brains, whether it's the teacher or us as adults or parents and so forth. So I think that that concept of thinking aloud as we write would also help students begin to do more metacognition about, so as you're writing, what do you think about thinking about? Do you see the audience? Do you understand the purpose? And we as adults, whether we're teachers or the coaches, it would be also be nice for us to do that metacognition. And that's why we have the students read aloud their draft, so we can listen and we can reflect and say, as you're reading, this is what I'm thinking, is that accurate? Or as you're reading, here's a question that I have. Tell me whether you're answering that question. So that's why I like the oral conversation that we do in writing coaches, because the conversation brings alive the thinking, as opposed to, I'm going to write it quietly, I'm going to hand it to a reader, the reader reads it quietly, and there's less social interaction. So I really appreciate what you're saying. The challenge, of course, for us as writing coaches is that 20 minutes goes by really quickly with one student. And the kinds of writing we're often working with are more restricted than some of the writing that we do throughout our lives, for example. So those are just some of the constraints that we face, but I really do like what you're saying, because I think that's simply a wonderful way to do teaching and learning with reflection.
Thank you, Beverly. Yeah, definitely.
One of the things, and I really have limited experience, I'm just getting started at coaching. But one of the things I found in interacting with students yesterday, I did have several students who said, I can't write, I'm not good at this, was to do the here and now. Well, let's see.
Yes.
And if they read that first paragraph and to find what they did right, to find
Yes.
that quickly and point that out and keep pointing that out along with the suggestions,
Absolutely.
kind of a here
Yeah.
and now.
And there is a ton of empirical research supporting why the way you did was effective. So there are different motivational theories. One of the theories, social learning theory, and relate to self-efficacy. Bandura has promoted the theory of self-efficacy is our personal belief in our competence in certain area. So you could have high self-efficacy in dancing than low self-efficacy in writing. So it doesn't have to go through all the different subject area, but there are 4 different components that support self-efficacy. And the biggest one is mastery experience. Is students being able to, so mastery experience of certain activity has consistently showing as the best boost for self-efficacy. And here there's a trick. It's not mastery experience of very simple task. It's mastery experience with a slightly challenging task. So here you can see if you were able to help students and find where they are successful and also engage them in tasks that finds interesting and challenging for them, they're much more likely to boost their self-efficacy and gradually change this belief that they're not good at writing. And there are other parts supporting self-efficacy that relate to vicarious experience. So sometimes kids might relate to a peer more often than adults, like a teacher or writing coach. They will be like, oh, of course you're a writer. You have successful experience as a legal assistant. What else can't you write? Or you're an English professor. How come you cannot write? So we're less relatable compared to peers. So that vicarious experience of asking them, yes, you find this task challenging, but were you the only person? They probably have a lots of peers finding challenging that task, and also seeing their peers able to overcome the challenge can be powerful testimony to boost their self-efficacy. And the last 2 is pep talk. Of this again connects to that negative self-talk of finding ways for students to encourage themselves, and which is connected to the 4th part, that physiological reaction. I don't know about you, but before today's presentation, I find my stomach is there's a butterfly in my stomach, and, which is very common before I teach, before I go public speaking. And there are different ways to interpret your physiological reaction. You could say, I'm so anxious because I just don't know enough about this topic. Of course, I'm feeling sick and want to avoid it. Or you could say, yes, there's excitement in my body because I'm going to meet these people who are so interested about writing. And I don't have to be the only expert in this room because everybody brings some expertise that we can share. So you see how that letting students recognize their physiological reaction and frame it in a way that connected to the growth mindset and connect to the positive self-image can be extremely powerful. So if next time they find their shoulders tense, you could say, yeah, we're slightly anxious about this, but maybe it's not because you're not a good writer, but because you realize this topic can go so many different directions that can go very exciting. And maybe we narrowed it down so that it can be more manageable for you. So you almost like Beverly said, this way of modeling how to interpret your thinking process and how to interpret your physiological reactions can be a tool that students carry on after that 25 minutes with you.
Thank you so much for that. This is Michelle. Let me turn my camera on if I can. No, No access.
Michelle.
So, sorry, but anyway, I just wanted to say this goes to the very first question we had from Chris about critical thinking and how that is. It's in our mission statement, right? And if you name, first of all, I've never had time with a student in my coaching sessions to actually name that, but I think we get there through modeling, through the process that of questioning that we go through. And you just gave us the best way to begin the session with that, because we do get that a lot, right? I hear it a lot as well, that I'm not a good writer. And sometimes I must have asked the question, why do you think that? But I can't think of any solid examples, but mostly I offer an example that maybe you feel that way because it's difficult for you, or something. But now I'm going to totally ditch that that way because we begin immediately with the questioning, the why behind the assertion, the why to support the assertion that you think you are not a good writer. It is a good way to model critical thinking, right? This is what we want you to do. This is how to do it. And we start out that way right from the get-go. I'm all excited about that. Thank you.
Michelle, what I like about what you said is that again, it goes back to what are their preconceptions or perceptions of what good writers do, because they don't see our brains or our hearts or our nerves or our shoulders. So, what do you think a good writer does? Tell me. And the student might go, I don't know what a good writer does. And so as we work with them in writing coaches, that's what I do as a writer. That's what all writers do. They think about their audience. They think about their purpose. They read it aloud to themselves. They put it aside for a while and come back and revisit it. They share it with a partner. There are some students who think that writing is a magic secret potion that if you drink it, you're going to come out with a perfect paper. And they say, where's the magic potion? And we're going to go, there is no magic potion. We all have to work and think, and we all start with a blank sheet of paper or a blank screen. But students have learned that there's a magic that they aren't privy to. And so asking our students, our students to say, well, what do you think makes a good, wow, this is what good writer, I do this as a writer and I'm still learning. Oh, wow, everybody goes through that as they look for their thesis or their main idea, or everybody does revision. But you see, that's not part of the reality in many classrooms. I'm not saying all, but I'm saying in many classrooms, they don't see that kind of generative thinking, reflection, writing. And so that's what we're striving to support, are those learning environments where students feel more and more comfortable saying, this is a draft and I want to share it with you so you can help me become more effective in my writing purpose and audience. So yeah, thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, and I just want to draw our attention to the chat. I know Sherry said, I found table 1 in the paper fascinating, comparing oral and written discourse. It makes me think that you could help a student move from the oral discourse to the written form, such as by asking them to visualize their audience and context.
Yeah, I think what we haven't talked about so far is the purpose of writing, which is a huge part of motivation, right? If you think you do anything, there is purpose behind it. And we all know intrinsic motivation, which means you do things not for tangible external outcomes, such as a grade or award. Intrinsic motivation is much more powerful compared to extrinsic motivation. But unfortunately, writing has always been this extrinsic driven in the school. If you finish this task, you got a grade. So a lot of times students are seeing the purpose of writing as to finish a task and get a grade. And they haven't really think about the vast majority of the purpose behind writing. Like most of you continue writing throughout your lifespan, not because of a task. Many of you don't write for a task, right? Either journaling or writing a book review or communicating to comfort a friend who you cannot hug in person, who go through loss and tragedy. You write, so there are so many different purposes behind writing that I think a lot of times students haven't been able to realize that. And I think although you only have 25 minutes to 30 minutes to engage with the student as task, but I also wonder if there could be space where you briefly mention about why do they think writing is for? What do they think writing is for beyond this task? I think a lot of times if they realize writing is a communication tool, is a communication with others, but also with self. I can't tell you how many times I feel so flustered and I start just writing whatever. And then it feels good to calm down. And writing is also good if they engage in this anxious cycle of, oh my gosh, I have so many tasks I need to do. Even if they write those tasks down as bullet points, that removes the mental burden. So writing serves as this semi-permanent space where their fluent and transitive thought can have a space. So if you can engage them in the idea of there's so many purposes of writing, and you're not only writing for your teacher, unfortunately, that's only often the case, but if they realize writing could be something they write to their friend, writing to their mom, parents, and writing to express their anger about the school policy, we have to wear uniform. But understanding there are so many different purposes behind writing can be extremely motivating too, and giving a lot of them more space to see why they have to engage in this activity in the first place. And then you're there to support them. So I do feel Writing Coach of Montana is such an awesome organization in terms of you provide a safe environment and letting students see there is an audience, and the writing is a process of communication. And one more thing I will add to that is there has been research done on how we think better if we're moving physically. So I don't know if any of you would have a chance to take a student for a walk or even walk in the physical building. But if you think of walk and writing, it's very similar. You meander in different parts. You're trying to figure out what fits together. And at the end of it, they could write about it. It's like think about your journey in that walk. And you could even think about how to write in your walk. So that connection of a physical activity that is less threatening and more comfortable to them, and an activity that they feel, oh my gosh, this is so hard. But if they see the connection between these two, it may also lower this cognitive challenge of a writing task. Yeah, so right now I'm trying to take some just quick walk around my house or the neighborhood before I need to write. And even start with writing, I don't know what to write, just this communication with myself in the paper before I zoom into that writing task can be extremely helpful. And I would encourage you student to try that too.
I love what you said about, movement, because in one of my classes, it's a 3-hour class, you're sitting down the entire time, you're looking up at the professor, absorbing as much as you can. What we've started doing is having a 15-minute walk in the middle of that 3-hour period to discuss, it's a class on love. So we discuss, how is love represented in our culture, and just these really cool questions. And I find that, when I'm walking and chatting, my mind feels just so much clearer. So yes, I can definitely attest to that.
Mm-hmm. there has been this really cool series of video called Dance Your PhD. So it's people presenting their dissertation thesis in this choreographed dance movement. I highly encourage you to. There are topics I really don't understand, like chemistry and physics, trying to understand this specific topic they're trying to study. But maybe one thing to experiment, I haven't never experimented myself, is to ask your student to physically perform out what they're trying to write. For example, they're trying to write these different opinions, can they use their body too? And the idea is the more different part they think writing can happen out of here, because otherwise they think this is magic. Like Beverly mentioned, it's magic medicine. You swallow in and then you spew out a beautiful paper. Maybe giving them a tool to realize, oh, this different part of movement. Why do I move that way if I think I need to write that way? Do I see a connection between those two? Because sometimes the body movement is more intuitive to students. So that's part of that embodied cognition, but also understanding distributed cognition of how we learn better when we talk to others. Is there any way you could share with your students of writing can be a conversation? If you're stuck and you don't have a writing coach, but there might be a peer, might be a sibling, might be another self, imaginative self, you're trying to bounce ideas off, so that they understand that thinking process doesn't come from this own space. It can come from others. That can be really powerful too.
Yeah, Sherry, you put something really interesting in the chat about how writing a word in the air helps memory. That's fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just what you said. It's that association between a movement. I talk with my hands too.
Yeah.
with a movement and something that you're trying to do, and it's a sort of a different approach to it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, absolutely.
I remember one of the assignments from last year from a science teacher. She wanted her students to summarize the cell unit and the different parts of the cell. And I sat down with a little girl and she absolutely had nothing on her paper. So I tried to relate to her about if she could remember what some of the things the teacher had said in the class, etc. And she sort of drew a blank. And I said, okay, let's pretend then that you have to draw a plant cell. Where would you start? And she said, well, I do this kind of rectangle and it'd be a cell wall. And then I said, and what would be next? And she said, well, the membrane, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I took her through the drawing of the cell. And then I said to her, look how much you know. And I said, all right, now tell me in writing what you know about the cell, because she went through it and could draw it. And then that helped her then. And so to me, that's kind of a physical thing that she went through.
And Jan, that's so fabulous. And there has been lots of tools, starting with drawing, like a mind map. If I do that a lot with my own writing of trying, it's almost an outline, but in a picture style, right? You draw, because drawing is, you can show the structure and it's more intuitive. And so drawing can be a great starting place. And then the other thing come to my mind is with Steve Graham, he mentioned every year he had this great opportunity working with different scholars across the whole globe of working together and talking about writing research. And guess what? These 20-some people who studied writing for decades cannot have a unanimous agreement on what writing is. And so again, to students of, writing can be a lot of things than you think about. right? And even when you're texting, right now technology, I don't know if you have ever been bothered by the autocorrect or
Yes.
the auto spelling, Gmail is doing a lot to me. If I type how R before the R come out, they will see, how are you doing? So this technology is not entirely new. It has been used for writing assistance for students with learning disability for a long while. But thinking about how technology is going to be with us in terms of facilitate writing, reduce that spelling overload on students, and how machine trying to figure out what we are writing. So it's something you can mention to the students of writing can be this activity beyond just your own. And they probably experience that in their texting too, of autocorrect and automatically showing what they want, or they talk to a phone and then the phone transcribe what they were talking. And to them, it may not seem a writing, but that is an excellent tool if they ever stuck. I would just say, do a voice memo talking about what you were thinking now, and let the computer transcribe that to you. And that will be your first draft instead of a blank page. Blank page is scary. It scares me too. But we do have a lot of tools that can take that pressure off.
I like what you said because it's multimodal. And so students who have different learning preferences might enter the writing process as pre-writing or revising through auditory or movement or music or drawing. And so it makes the concept of writing more inclusive, if you will. And I really like that. I think some of the challenges that we face in the schools is how do we help students who are very facile in email or texting or whatever, Twitter, TikTok, and all of that. How do we help them take all that creativity and thoughtfulness and then put it into the more academic world of the classroom? Or take the world of the classroom and make it more relevant into multimodal presentations to other audiences and purposes. So it's those crossovers and interconnections that I think education is grappling with all of the time. And until assessments are equally creative and inclusive, hot topic, right? I think, again, often we teach what's assessed, but what we assess isn't always what's most valued or valuable. So I always want to think about what's the big picture. And the big picture, as we all know, is communication, thoughtfulness, problem solving, respect, shared humanity. And that's what we're all striving to do. So it's just a matter of making sure everything lines up and we don't give our students mixed messages. Oh, writing for learning is really important, but there's a test tomorrow.
Yeah. And I do think as writing coaches, you do have more flexibility in that realm in terms of presenting that big picture and letting students understand assessment is only one way of what writing is for. There are so many more ways. I think there's a benefit for that. And maybe some of them grow up to become policymakers and change the entire thing of assessment.
That would be nice.
Yeah, the more of us fighting against it, I think the more power and track we would have. Yeah, this is really wonderful. Thank you all so much. I enjoy our conversation a lot, and I hope you find anything beneficial or interesting to continue thinking about after today's meeting.
Absolutely, Dr. Sun. You have been absolutely fabulous. And you said that you would visit us again. And I do truly hope that you will find time in the future to come back to one of our meetups. So it's been great. And thank you, everybody, for participating and being so good about putting things in the chat. I think that usually Shasta likes to end everybody putting one word in the chat that just kind of exemplifies how they feel about today's meetup. Shasta, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it was really cool to have people like one thing they learned, something they found interesting. just a few words, one sentence would be great. I know I learned a lot, so love to see.
Okay.
And I'd
All
love
right.
to learn later if you can share with me. I do have to go. I have a class at 5. So otherwise,
Thank
I
you,
would love
Dr.
to stay
Sun.
with you, but I will go to my other Zoom meeting and meet with
Okay.
All right,
Get a drink
Keep
of
posted.
water.
Yes. All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
bye, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.